General Patton's staff on 10 November had drawn plans for an all-out assault on Casablanca next day, and Admiral Michelier had prepared for desperate resistance. But at 7 a.m. November 11, 15 minutes before this attack was to start, the French army commander sent Patton a flag of truce. He had received a ceasefire order from Admiral Darlan at Algiers. This was the result of protracted negotiations between that French Admiral Marshal Pétain's second-in-command in the Vichy government, Robert Murphy of the American Foreign Service, and General Mark Clark. Darlan's order, issued at 11 a.m. November 10, brought peace between French and Allied forces in North Africa, but plenty of trouble for metropolitan France. There was no surrender, no transfer of sovereignty, merely a ceasefire which developed into full cooperation between Allied and French authorities, military and civil. The French naval administration at Casablanca immediately placed port facilities, installations, tugs, pilots and divers at our disposal. Thus, after 3 days' sharp fighting, the traditional friendship was renewed under the happiest circumstance of making common cause against the Axis powers. But we had not yet heard from the Axis. On the evening of 11 November, 15 transports and cargo ships of Admiral Hewitt's Western Naval Task Force were still at anchor in Fedhala roadstead. U-173 worked in between them and the shore, evading their screen and a protective minefield. It torpedoed and sank transport Joseph Hughes, then torpedoed but failed to sink Euler Winooski and destroyer Hambleton. The following evening, U-130, by using the same tactics, made 3 victims: transports Edward Rutledge, Tasker H. Bliss, and Hugh L. Scott. Their cargoes were mostly lost, and over 100 men were killed or died of wounds. On the 15th, USS Electra was torpedoed about 17 miles off Fedhala by U-173, but more fortunate than her British namesake in the Java Sea, she did not sink. That U-boat hung around Casablanca too long for its health. Through good teamwork between destroyers Woolsey, Swanson and Quick, it was sunk off the harbour entrance on 16 November. By that time, almost every ship of Admiral Hewitt's group which had not departed was safely inside Casablanca harbour. As a definite seal to Darlan's ceasefire order of 10 November, the French admiral, secretly assured by Marshal Pétain of his approval, drew up a formal accord with General Eisenhower and Admiral Cunningham, which was ratified by Churchill and Roosevelt on the 15th. By virtue of this pact, Admiral Darlan became head of the civil government in North Africa, and General Giraud, who had escaped from a German prison and been brought to Gibraltar in a submarine commanded by Captain Gerald Wright, became head of the French armed forces in North Africa. This Darlan deal, denounced as a base truckling to Vichy by General de Gaulle and by British and American left-wingers, ensured French cooperation with the Allies, saved very many lives, and prevented an inestimable amount of sabotage and obstruction to Allied military operations. Simultaneously with Admiral Hewitt's landings in Morocco, and equally powerful and important, were those of American and British troops, escorted by the Royal Navy, near Oran and Algiers. Both forces were mounted in the United Kingdom, drawing on the United States Army contingents which General Marshall had hoped to use in a cross-channel operation. In the small hours of the morning of D-Day, 8 November, His Majesty's ship Heartland and Walney, former United States Coast Guard cutters transferred to the Royal Navy in 1941, dashed into Oran Harbour carrying a small United States Naval and Marine Guard, and 400 picked American troops. Unlike Bernado's assault on Safi, this enterprise was a dismal failure. The local French, alerted, raked both vessels with point-blank fire, sank them and killed about half their crews and passengers. The main landings of troops lifted by Centre Task Force, Commodore Thomas Trowbridge, the 1st Infantry Division and part of the 1st Armoured Division, United States Army, took place on 2 sets of beaches, each side of Oran. Those in the Gulf of Arzeau were noteworthy for the use of 2 British Maracaibos, shoal-draft oilers from Venezuela, fitted with a big bow ramp for landing tanks. These were prototypes of the famous landing ship tank. The 2 columns of troops converged on Oran, where all resistance ceased November. Algiers was taken by the Eastern Naval Task Force, Rear Admiral Sir Harold M. Burrow, lifting the Eastern Assault Force, comprising regimental combat teams of the 9th and 34th Infantry Divisions United States Army, and 2 brigade groups of the British Army, which here outnumbered the American contingent 2-1. This force, too, was mounted in the United Kingdom and escorted by the Royal Navy. 5 of the transports were American, one of which, Thomas Stone, was crippled by a U-boat's torpedo on 7 November off the Spanish coast. The ships, boat crews and troops of this force had had only a few days' amphibious training, with the result that the landing, though unopposed, was a complete foul-up. The same state of affairs characterized the unopposed landings from British transports west of Algiers. No fewer than 98 of the 104 landing craft used in all sectors of the Eastern Naval Task Force were expended, a loss so scandalous that the Army put in a bid for taking charge of all future landing operations. French resistance ceased in and around Algiers on D-Day, 8 November, but the Axis picked up the ball, and over a period of a week the big transports unloading were subjected to severe bombing and torpedo attacks by land-based Junkers and Heinkels. USS Leedstown was the principal casualty. She had to be abandoned and sank. As a result of this massive 3-pronged amphibious operation, North Africa west of Tunisia was denied to the Axis. Valuable airdromes, military, naval and anti-submarine bases were secured, and foundations laid for driving the Germans out of North Africa. The Royal and United States Navies had learned far more about amphibious operations than they ever could have done from the most prolonged training and rehearsal. Later assaults in the European theatre would have failed, but for the lessons learned in Torch. Those lessons were: 1. The need of better seamanship and design in small landing craft. The original plywood and rampless Higgins boat proved inadequate, and the Navy henceforth concentrated on building steel, diesel-powered and ramped types, such as the landing craft personnel, ramped landing craft, vehicles and personnel and landing craft, mechanized. 2. The pressing need of big beaching craft, the landing ship tank, landing craft tank and landing craft infantry, to bring in tanks, vehicles and large units of troops quickly. 3. From the Navy's point of view, the advisability of renouncing tactical surprise in order to deliver gunfire support and land by daylight, a point of view the Army was not yet ready to accept. Owing to the half-hearted, sporadic resistance offered by the French, we had yet to experience a stoutly contested amphibious operation. The Germans would provide that at Salerno and the Japanese at Tarawa before the end of 1943. Bold as Operation Torch was, and successful within its sphere, it could well have been a little bolder and secured Tunisia too, as Admiral Cunningham wanted. There the Germans beat us at the draw. Admiral Esteva, head of the French government in Tunisia, was well disposed to the Allies, but overpowered by German troops arriving by ferry plane. Frenzied efforts were made by the Germans to convert this country into an African bastion, since the British Army, led by General Montgomery, after winning the Second Battle of El Alamein on 3 November, was slowly and deliberately pursuing Rommel westward. This year, 1942, closed on a static situation in Tunisia. The Anglo-American First Army was bogged down in Algerian mud. Montgomery's forces were dusted down by sandstorms. The Germans had occupied the ports of Bizerta, Sousse, Sfax and Gabes. The Royal Navy, respecting the powerful air forces that the enemy had deployed, was not yet ready to challenge Axis control of the Straits of Sicily. Malta stood firm, but the Axis had won the race for Tunisia. The military campaign for Tunisia, which lies outside the scope of this volume, did not end until 13 May 1943. Axis forces 275,000 strong, which had been pushed into Cape Bon, then completed their surrender to American Second Corps Major General Omar N. Bradley and British Eighth Army General Sir Harold Alexander. On 17 May, the first Allied trans-Mediterranean convoy since 1941 left Gibraltar, and on the 26th it reached Alexandria without loss. The Suez lifeline now reopened. No longer did ships bound for the Indian Ocean and Australia have to round the Cape of Good Hope. If Torch put the Navy on its toes, the Tunisian experience was equally valuable for the Army. There it learned how to fight seasoned German troops, and developed the competence of corps and divisional commanders for a much bigger show. There, Generals Bradley and Patton first had a chance to prove their exceptional, though diverse, military qualities. In all three elements, ground, sea and air, British and Americans had learned how to win battles together. Thus, whilst one can argue that Torch was a mistake, and that the Marshall Plan of cross-channel operations in 1942 to 1943 should never have been allowed to lapse, Almost everyone who studies the Tunisian campaign must conclude that the postponement was correct. We were simply not ready to launch, and still less to follow up, a massive assault on Festung Europa in 1942 to 1943. Since that had to be postponed, a question arose as before. What could the Allies do in 1943 to engage the Axis and take pressure off Russia? A plenary combined Chiefs of Staff conference with President Roosevelt and Premier Churchill met at Casablanca between 14 and 23 January 1943 to consider that and other questions. This conference ended in a strategic compromise. The British removed their objection to America's exploiting the initiative she had won in the Pacific. America consented to take part in another Mediterranean operation and to postpone the cross-channel invasion until 1944. Both agreed that the defeat of the U-boat must remain a first charge on the resources of the United Nations, since if that failed, everything would fail. In consequence of that decision, the United States gave AAA priority to the construction of destroyer escorts, escort carriers, and anti-submarine aircraft, placing landing and beaching craft in a lower category. That is why a worldwide shortage of such craft occurred in 1944. Admirals King and Pound now persuaded the conference to make Sicily the next objective in order to secure the Mediterranean line of communications, increase pressure on Italy, and divert German forces from the Russian front. The conference also adopted a rough plan for Operation Husky, an Anglo-American invasion of Sicily for July 1943, with General Eisenhower as Supreme Commander, Admiral Cunningham Naval Commander, and Air Chief Marshal Tedder Air Commander. American strategists hoped that Sicily would put a stopper on Mediterranean campaigns, so that we could get on with the big cross-channel invasion. The British, on the contrary, looked on Sicily as another rung of the ladder to what Churchill called the soft underbelly of the Axis. Thus, as Admiral King predicted, once we started in the Mediterranean, we would have to go on, and the underbelly turned out to be boned with the Apennines, plated with the hard scales of Kesselring's armour, and shadowed by the wings of the Luftwaffe. The other important decision at Casablanca, and the only one made public, was a resolution to accept nothing less than unconditional surrender of Germany, Italy, and, by implication, Japan. The Prime Minister and Franklin Delano Roosevelt were jointly responsible for the principle, and Roosevelt for the publicity and the phrase, which he remembered vaguely from the history of the Civil War. It was received with joy and acclamation in the Allied countries, where it dispelled the fear of a Darlan deal with Hitler, Mussolini, and Hirohito, or the adoption of something like a Wilsonian 14 points, the meaning of which could be argued indefinitely. The decision to utter this rallying slogan was not lightly made. The American, Russian, and British people, especially the last two, had suffered so severely that they had to be promised complete victory. No peace of Amiens, no mere truce which would leave Germany strong enough to start up again. And the Americans felt the same about Japan. But did not unconditional surrender help the Axis leaders to persuade their people to fight at Lutrances as the only alternative to virtual slavery? Possibly so, probably not. Italy's surrender in 1943 was highly conditional, and both the Nazis and the Japanese warlords, right up to the moment of their complete defeat, imagined that they could make a deal. In my opinion, unconditional surrender did not prolong the war a day, and can in no way be considered responsible for our post-war troubles. The Casablanca conferees, meeting in an atmosphere of euphoria following the success of Roku, had eyes bigger than their stomachs and laid out a strategic menu that they could not digest. Although Nusky did come off at the target date, it was at the expense of other things: a quick follow-up in the Pacific after the securing of Guadalcanal and Papua, a drive from India toward Akyab in Burma, and the build-up of American forces in Britain for the now postponed cross-channel operation. Shipping was the bottleneck for everything, and Admiral Dönitz was doing very well in his efforts to squeeze that neck. In Chapter 5 above, we left the anti-submarine situation in June 1942 considerably improved, but it did not long stay improved. Dönitz started a new U-boat blitz in August, which reached its acme in March 1943. He now had echelons of wolf packs strung across all transatlantic convoy routes between Iceland and the Azores, especially in what we called the Black Pit outside the range of land-based aircraft. These tactics were exceedingly difficult to beat, and beaten they were not for 8 months. In August 1942, the Allies lost 102 merchant ships of over 500,000 gross tons to submarine attack in Atlantic and Arctic waters. Not one transatlantic merchant convoy escaped attack. During the next 4 months, an average of almost a ship a day was lost on the North Atlantic convoy routes, and sinkings in the Caribbean and among unconvoyed merchant ships trying to round the Cape of Good Hope, access to Suez still being closed, were also heavy. Although the convoy system had been extended, much transatlantic traffic was still carried in unescorted merchant ships with naval armed guards. Their fine fighting spirit is illustrated by the Battle of Liberty ship Stephen Hopkins, Paul Buck, master, with 2 armed German ships, Raider J armed with 6 5.9-inch guns, and blockade runner Tannenfels. These 2 attacked Hopkins at latitude 28 degrees south, longitude 20 degrees west, on 27 September 1942. Ensign K.M. Willett and his naval armed guard, operating the freighter's 1 4-inch gun, scored 35 hits on Raider J and forced her abandonment. After a German shell had exploded the magazine for Willett's gun, the ship's second mate and crew operated 2 37mm guns forward, firing at Tannenfels, which was raking their decks with machine gun fire, Captain Buck manoeuvring his ship so as to bring all possible gunfire to bear. This unequal battle continued for almost 3 hours, when Stephen Hopkins, aflame from stem to stern and holed below her waterline, plunged with colours flying, but Raider J had preceded her to the bottom. The one undamaged American lifeboat, without charts or navigation instruments, made the coast of Brazil after a voyage of 31 days, with only 15 men of the Liberty ship's crew still alive. In January, while the combined chiefs of staff and their guests were basking in the sunshine at Casablanca and planning great doings for 1943, one of the worst winters on record was lashing the Western Ocean. Hardly a day passed without snow squalls or bone-chilling rain. Heavy seas broke continuously over vessels' bows, icing their superstructures in the high latitudes. These conditions were even worse for merchant ships than for U-boats, which could get under. During most of the winter, the weather was so foul that long-range land-based planes could not fly, and several of those that did never returned. Merchant ship losses by marine casualty alone, for the 5 months November 1942–March 1943, reached the unprecedented figure of 92 vessels in the Atlantic, 166 for all parts of the world. Sinkings from U-boat attack reached an all-time high in November 1942, 106 ships of 637,907 gross tons. In January 1943, a convoy escorted by 4 British corvettes from Trinidad to Gibraltar lost 7 out of 9. As a sample, here is what happened to a couple of transatlantic convoys early in 1943. Westbound convoy on 166, 63 ships, escorted by Captain P.R. Heinemann's unit, comprising United States Coast Guard cutter Spencer and Campbell, 5 British and Canadian corvettes, and Polish destroyer Berza, between 12 and 25 February, lost 7 merchant ships, but sank 2 U-boats, one by Spencer with depth charges, one by Campbell through ramming and gunfire, after Berza had depth charged it. The escort unit had barely entered the uneasy shelter of Argentia, Newfoundland, when it was ordered out, augmented by USS Greer, to take charge of eastbound convoy SC-121 of 56 ships. Thrice in 4 days, 6 to 9 March, this unfortunate convoy was set upon by wolf packs. At least 7 ships were torpedoed, and all but one sunk, with unusually heavy loss of life, including that of the British convoy Commodore. The sea was so rough that even Greer's veteran sailors on one occasion could not pick up survivors from lifeboats and rafts, and had to let them go. Both in this and the next slow convoy 122, which lost 9 ships, and in HX 229, which lost 11 ships on 8 to 10 March, there were numerous acts of heroism and self-sacrifice on the part of merchant seamen, as well as coastguardsmen and bluejackets. Few outside the 2 navies and merchant marines realized how serious the situation had become in March 1943. The U-boats, in this and other areas, sank 108 ships that month, totaling 627,000 tons, and lost only 15 of their number. So many Allied escort vessels were under repair that the group organization was disintegrating. So many U-boats were at sea, an average of 116 operating daily in the North Atlantic, that evasive routing was futile. A convoy avoided one concentration of wolf packs only to fall into the fangs of another. No enemy ever came so near to disrupting Atlantic communications as Duntis did that month. All this had a very damaging effect on Britain's imports. These, the Joint Chiefs of Staff had agreed early in 1942, must be kept above a certain norm in order to keep her people fighting, producing, and even eating. British imports, owing largely to the work of the U-boats, had declined from a pre-war average of over 50 million tons to 23 million in 1942, and by the end of that year Britain was eating her own tail. In November, Franklin Delano Roosevelt promised the Prime Minister to allot England enough newly built merchant ships to raise her imports to a marginal 27 million tons next year. But it was some months before this relief came forth, and as most of the follow-up torch convoys from the United Kingdom to North Africa had to be under the Red Ensign, food stocks in Britain fell off to a 3-month supply in January 1943. In order that England might not live from hand to mouth, Churchill reduced by half sailings to the Indian Ocean around the Cape, a drastic measure which brought Bengal to the verge of famine. It was, unfortunately, typical of the hit-or-miss methods of wartime administration that the Joint Chiefs of Staff first heard of the President's promise from Sir John Dill, the Combined Chiefs of Staff representative in Washington. Thus Lieutenant General Brecon Somervell of the United States Army Service of Supply attended the Casablanca conference both uninstructed and confused. He neither knew what the President had promised or what his country was able to do about it, and he made a fuzzy sort of agreement with his British opposite number, which might be interpreted that we were to give the British 300,000 tons of shipping, or 7 million tons. In March 1943, with the situation clouded by protracted German resistance in Tunisia and U-boat achievements in the North Atlantic, this misunderstanding blew up in everybody's face. To implement the President's promise would require, in April-June, 9 million tons of cargo ships to Britain for the rest of 1943. This also included 14 sailings per month to the Mediterranean to support Husky, and 25 sailings per month to the Indian Ocean for the planned drive on Akyab. Churchill wrote severely to Roosevelt, "We cannot live from hand to mouth on promises limited by provisos." Admiral King and the other members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff felt, on the contrary, that the important thing was to get on with the war. Britain must tighten her belt. A nasty situation was developing between the military heads of both countries, when President Roosevelt took it out of their hands and gave it to a special board of civilians, presided over by Harry Hopkins. On 29 March, Hopkins Lewis Douglas, then Deputy Chief of Warshipping Administration, and Sir Anthony Eden, the British Foreign Minister, met with the President at the White House. Douglas presented the case for maintaining the level of British imports if we wished to avoid weakening the entire war effort. He further declared that American armed services estimates of necessary shipping were generally inflated and that they wasted tonnage scandalously. Roosevelt decided in Britain's favour and gave strict orders that his November promise be implemented as it was. The British import programme rapidly revived, and in May the President directed the War Shipping Administration to transfer 15 to 20 new freighters a month to the Red Ensign. But this presidential promise could never have been kept, and the British people would have approached famine in 1943, but for a dramatic reverse of fortune in the anti-submarine war in April and May. First came success in anti-submarine operations. The glorious battle of a British escort group under Commander P.W. Gretton to westbound convoy WNS-5 is regarded both by the Allies and the Germans as a turning point in the North Atlantic struggle. Dönitz deployed no fewer than 51 U-boats to destroy this 42-ship convoy. The battle raged almost continuously in foul weather from 28 April to 6 May. 13 merchantmen, including 3 Americans, were sunk, but an escort that never numbered more than 9 ships sank 5 U-boats, and 2 Catalinas, 1 Canadian and 1 American, disposed of 2 more. This victory was followed by another in the Bay of Biscay offensive, which Air Vice Marshal Sir John Slessor of Coastal Command had been conducting since March. His plan was to train bomber planes based on southern England, operating in connection with Royal Navy corvettes, to catch U-boats going and coming near their French outports on the bay. Aircraft-mounted microwave radar, which the Germans could not detect, picked up surfaced U-boats at night. Then the new Lee searchlight illuminated them, and if they were not sunk, a surface unit was homed in to do the job. In May 1943, the results of this Bay offensive, added to others, meant 38 U-boats sunk, 12 more than were built, and 3 less than the number of merchant ships lost in the Atlantic and Arctic Oceans. The Bay offensive, continuing to the end of the year with American liberators pitching in to help, broke the back of Donitz's submarine campaign. There was also a vast improvement in organization and method. On 1 May 1943, Admiral King organized 10th Fleet, with himself as commander and Rear Admiral Francis S. Lowe as Chief of Staff, to combine all existing anti-submarine activities. Lowe, tough, intelligent and hard-working, was a perfect alter ego to King, who did not have the time to give this branch of warfare the detailed attention it required. He ruled with an iron hand, but had the respect of his subordinates, who were never allowed to doubt what he wanted and were never let down. The destroyer escort program finally bore fruit. Some 250 of these new escort vessels had been authorized in January 1942, but the shifting of priority work in American shipyards to beaching and landing craft for the cross-channel operation that never came off so delayed the program that by 2 June only 42 had been launched. They were now produced in such abundance that by December 260 destroyer escorts were in commission. There was a similar delay in building escort carriers. These escort carriers, capable of carrying about 24 operating planes, were badly wanted as additional protection to convoys. The first, USS Bogue, got into action in March 1943. At the same time, the production of land-based aircraft types suitable for anti-submarine work so increased that in the second half of 1943, the Navy was able to relieve the Army Air Force of anti-submarine duties which it had assumed at a time of desperate need. Liberators, PB-4Ys, same as the Army B-24s, had a radius of 900 miles from Newfoundland or the British Isles, and smaller bombers had a radius of 500 miles from Greenland or Iceland. But there was still a mid-ocean black pit, where no air protection could reach a convoy unless brought to it by escort carrier. This was not lighted up until late 1943, when Portugal gave the Allies permission to base anti-submarine planes on the Azores. Not even Mr. Churchill expected Operation Husky to be soft. As an historian, he knew that Greeks, Carthaginians, Romans, Byzantines, Saracens, Normans, Angevins and Spaniards in succession had had their will of this great and fair island, but each conquest had taken years to complete. Sicily had never been so defensible, at least in theory, as in 1943. It contained about a dozen airfields, and its garrison was formidable, at least on paper. The greater part of the island is mountainous, difficult to traverse except by main roads. The Strait of Messina is so narrow that reinforcements can easily be poured in from Italy. General Eisenhower, preoccupied with the Tunisian campaign and bedevilled by the rivalries of de Gaulle, Giraud and other French leaders in Africa, was unable to give much attention to planning Husky. Most of the essential work was done at Hewitt's and Cunningham's headquarters in Algiers, and General Patton's at Mostaganem, 165 miles distant, much too distant for proper planning. For D-Day, the night of 9 to 10 July was chosen because the moon set around 2:30 a.m. The Air Forces wanted moonlight for their paratroop drop, and the Army wanted darkness to commence landing at 2:45 a.m. 9 Allied divisions, 4 American, 4 British and 1 Canadian, were available for the initial assault, and about the same number of German and Italian divisions were expected to be on hand to oppose. The plan finally selected in mid-May, after much wrangling, provided for Hewitt's Western Naval Task Force to land on 3 sets of beaches near Licata, Gela and Scoglitti on the southwest coast of Sicily, and the British to land on beaches around the southeastern cape of the island. Patton would drive across the island to secure Palermo, and then swing east to Messina, while Montgomery drove north to Syracuse, Augusta, Catania, and Messina. This was a poor strategic plan, better calculated to push the Axis forces out of Sicily than to trap them in Sicily. But its chief weakness lay in the refusal of the United States Army Air Forces to cooperate, largely because General Toohey Spatz was wedded to the concept of strategic air operations, which meant the Army Air Force or forces fighting its own war. He planned to devote practically his entire strength to fighting the Luftwaffe and the Royal Italian Air Force. And not until 2 weeks before D-Day did Spatz even let Hewitt and Patton know that this was his intention. The Army Air Force or Forces and Royal Air Force opened this Sicilian campaign on 2 July with an implacable day and night hammering of enemy headquarters and of 10 or 12 Sicilian airfields, which were rendered temporarily unusable. But the amphibious expedition sailed and landed with no promise of tactical support from the air, and almost none did it obtain. An important air unit, which came under 7th Army, not the Army Air Force or Forces, and which greatly helped, was the 82nd Airborne Division, Major General Matthew B. Ridgway. This, the first paratroop division in the United States Army, made its combat debut in Husky. Its mission was to seize high ground and the Ponte Olivo airfield behind the landing beaches, confuse the defence and prevent a prompt counterattack on the beachhead. This division no more than the Navy could obtain night fighter protection from the Army Air Force. The Army Air Force or Forces did have night-flying fighter planes and pilots, but had other uses for them. The capture of Sicily was an undertaking of the first magnitude, as Churchill wrote. Measured by the strength of the initial assault, it breaks all records for amphibious operations. Even the Normandy landings next year exceeded it only if follow-up echelons are counted. Admiral Hewitt had 508 ships, and Admiral Ramsay had 795 ships under their respective commands. In addition, Vice Admiral Sir Algernon Willis commanded a Royal Navy covering force of 6 battleships, 6 cruisers, and 24 destroyers. The nature of the operation was part ship-to-shore, part shore-to-shore, this last being made possible by the arrival in North Africa of the first big beaching craft, the 1,500-ton, 328-foot landing ship tank, including the 550-ton, 112-foot landing craft tank, and the 200-ton, 158-foot landing craft infantry large. The biggest of these, the landing ship tank, modified from a British design, were built at Newport News, trained in Chesapeake Bay, and early in 1943 began crossing the Atlantic on their own bottoms, as the landing craft infantry did too. Landing craft's tank came over on the decks of landing ships, tank or on freighters. Admirals Connolly and Hall, who had specially interested themselves in these types, experimented with them to ascertain their capabilities, and used them extensively in Husky. According to Thucydides, the Greeks who invaded Syracuse in 413 BC had most to fear from the Sicilian cavalry, against which, for want of a landing ship horse, their only defence was archery. Enemy tanks, the modern cavalry, are now the bane of amphibious landings. In order to prevent their working havoc on the GLS, it was necessary to land our own tanks and anti-tank guns with or immediately after the assault troops. That was the main function of the landing ship tank and landing craft tank. These craft were supposed to be able to ground on a beach and lower their ramps, over which tanks, guns and vehicles could roll ashore. The landing craft infantry beached and then lowered bow gangways, not unlike the brows of a Greek byrame, for infantry to land without boating or swimming. Unfortunately, most of the Sicilian beaches were protected by sandbars with enough water to float landing craft, but not a landing ship tank. The WWII, an amphibious truck which could carry 25 troops or 27 tons of cargo, swim in the water and roll over the land, and required only one driver, also made its European debut in Husky. The great advantage of the WWII was its ability to carry supplies from a ship to an inland dump without handling at the water's edge. The Axis was partly, but not completely surprised by the Sicilian assault. Hitler, swallowing a clever British plant to the effect that the real objectives were Sardinia and Greece, dispatched reinforcements to both places. But Marshal Kesselring, the German commander in Italy, was not fooled and sent a panzer division to Sicily as reinforcement. That added up to 2 German and 4 Italian combat divisions, in addition to 6 Italian coastal divisions, which were composed mostly of overage Sicilian reservists. There were over 300,000 men under arms in Sicily when the Anglo-American Expeditionary Force landed on 10 July 1943, and the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, had about 10 AM serviceable planes within flying distance of the landings. On the other hand, Mussolini prudently kept his navy in protected harbours, such as Spezia. The German navy was represented by only a few U-boats and motor torpedo boats, and the Italian Air Force consisted largely of obsolete planes. Another asset to the invaders was the friendly attitude of the Sicilians and of the Mafia, or Black Hand. Gangsters and peasants alike hated Germans, were fed up with the Duce, and looked on their invaders as liberators. Admiral Hewitt's Western Naval Task Force, mounted at or staged through 6 different harbours along the Algerian and Tunisian littoral, ran into a sharp and sudden mistral north of Malta that blew up a high-breaking sea. This tested the endurance of the new beaching craft and the seamanship of their crews. Both met it magnificently. Carrying to a lower level the diagram at the head of the last section, Hewitt's Western Naval Task Force was divided 3 ways from west to east. Rear Admiral Connolly's Joss Force to land Major General Truscott's 3rd Infantry Division on beaches near Licata, Rear Admiral John L. Hall's Dime Force to land Major General Terry Allen's 1st Infantry Division on beaches near Gela, and Rear Admiral Alan G. Kirk's Cent Force to land Lieutenant General Omar N. Bradley and 2nd Corps Staff, and Major General Troy Middleton's 45th Infantry Division on beaches near Skogliti. Connolly, Hall and Kirk, as well as Admiral Hewitt, were experienced practitioners of amphibious warfare. Kirk had relieved Hewitt as confiblant, and as such trained his Cent Force in Chesapeake Bay. Hall, who came to Africa as Hewitt's Chief of Staff, had been Confib Force Northwest African Waters since early in the year. Up to a certain point, the story of these 3 landings is similar. Although their targets were miles apart, the military objective was the same: to establish a beachhead as a base from which to begin the march on Palermo and Messina. It had to be deep enough so that boats, ships and beaches would be outside enemy artillery range. On the evening of 9 July, the Western Naval Task Force, still undetected, was fast approaching the Sicilian shore. Beacon submarines, to help the vessels find their targets with infrared blinkers, were stationed about 5 miles off each set of beaches. In addition, Joss Force had destroyer Bristol 5 miles south of the submarines, and a patrol craft south of her. 3 lampposts to help the new beaching craft find their way. There is nothing in warfare to be compared with the hushed tension of the final approach in a night landing. Everything ahead is uncertain. There is no sound but the rush of waters, the throbbing of your ship's engines and of your own heart. You can see nothing but the ship ahead and the ship astern. The shore, if dimly visible, is shrouded in darkness. A few mistakes on our part, or clever thrusts by the enemy, may utterly wreck a vast, long-planned effort. There can be no drawn battle, no half-success in an amphibious landing. It is win all splendidly, or lose all miserably. The enemy was not entirely surprised, but unready. Many officers of Italian coastal divisions, in view of the foul weather, turned in, and German search radar crews could not believe the enormous blips they saw on their screens. Small groups of beach defenders commonly deserted their pillboxes in panic when they saw the imposing and terrifying spectacle revealed by the first light of dawn. There had been nothing like it in Sicilian history since the Athenian expedition against Syracuse, no less famous for its wonderful audacity and for the splendour of its appearance than for its overwhelming strength, as Thucydides wrote. As Sicilians later described the scene to me, there were thousands of vessels in the roadstead. One couldn't see the horizon for the ships. The Allies had ringed a good third of Sicily with a wall of ships. No power on earth could prevent them from establishing beachheads, and it would take more power than the Axis had to keep them from taking the island. Connolly's Joss landings around Licata were noteworthy for the skill with which the landing craft's infantry and landing craft's tank beached in rough surf to land troops and tanks, and for naval gunfire support. Every large troop unit carried a shore-fire control party, which communicated by walkie-talkie radio with a destroyer or cruiser of Rear Admiral Lawrence Dubos's support group, cruisers Brooklyn and Birmingham, destroyers Buck and Ludlow, and frequently asked them to put a few shells on a spot where the enemy showed resistance. By noon, General Truscott was setting up his command post in the city of Licata. Already 3,000 Italian troops had been taken prisoner. The Joss Force landings were smooth and successful, securing the left flank of the Allied assault and a port for follow-up. Rear Admiral Hall's Dime Force, which landed around Gela, encountered the toughest opposition and had the satisfaction of repelling 2 enemy tank assaults with naval gunfire. Here, most of the troops came in big transports and were taken ashore in landing craft. The first boats hit the beach exactly at H-hour 2:45 a.m. Everything went smoothly until dawn brought enemy air attacks. At 4:58 a.m., just as daylight began to spread over the sea, destroyer Maddox, on anti-submarine patrol several miles offshore, was attacked by a Stuka. A bomb exploded under her propeller guard, demolishing the stern and exploding the after magazine. Within 2 minutes, Maddox rolled over and sank, taking down her commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Sarsfield, and most of her crew. Cruisers of the Dime Force support group, without waiting for fire support parties to issue invitations, catapulted their float planes to look for targets. One of these cruisers was Boise, repaired better than new after her battering in the Battle of Cape Esperance, and with Captain L. Hewlett Thabord as commanding officer. The other was Savannah, Captain R. W. Carey. Since their float planes had no fighter protection, most of them were shot down by Messerschmitts, but one at 8:30 a.m. reported 2 columns of about 25 Italian tanks each approaching the beachhead. Boise's 6-inch fire stopped one column, and destroyer Shubrick deprived the other of several units. Boise also silenced a shore battery that was enfilading the beach, and Admiral Ramsey kindly lent Admiral Hall HM Monitor Abercrombie to plant a few 15-inch shells on Nissemi, 8 miles inland. Thus, naval gunfire played the role of the Athenian archers against Sicilian cavalry in the famous invasion of 413 BC. One of the bottlenecks in amphibious operations has always been the congestion of supplies on the beaches. Army shore parties are supposed to carry the bales, boxes, and other stuff to supply dumps, but they hate the job and never do it fast enough. By nightfall D-Day, the Gela beaches were so congested that some landing craft had to return to their ships fully loaded. Others, which had managed to find a spot to beach, swamped through their open ramps because nobody would help their exhausted crews to unload. The enemy had almost complete control of the air over the beachhead, while Army Air Force or Forces and Royal Air Force flew strategic. A renewal of tank counterattacks at daylight was certain, but how could they be met? Landing ship Tank 313, carrying all anti-tank guns of Dime Force, had been destroyed at sunset on D-Day by a Messerschmitt. Other landing ships, tank-carrying tanks, could not get into the beach over the bars. Thus, the main burden of supporting the 1st Infantry Division in a really tough assault by a German tank column on 11 July fell on the Navy. Intermittently, over a period of 10 hours, 2 cruisers and 8 different destroyers fired on enemy tanks and infantry, advancing or retreating, destroyed half the tanks and demoralized the foot soldiers. Next day, naval gunfire supported our own advancing troops up to 8 miles inland. So devastating in its effectiveness, wrote General Eisenhower, was this shooting as to dispose finally of any doubts that naval guns are suitable for shore bombardment. On the other hand, the paratroops won naval converts owing to the magnificent job done by Colonel James M. Gavin's Regimental Combat Team of the 82nd Airborne Division. This was the first troop airdrop ever attempted at night, so it is not surprising that the 3,400 paratroops were dispersed along 60 miles of coast. But a part of one battalion which dropped behind Gela held up a German tank column on D-Day, harassed the retreating tanks on the 11th, and greatly contributed to the confusion between the Italian and the German defenders. We shall later see airborne playing a vital role in the Normandy operation. In Admiral Kirk's Cent Force area, centred on the fishing village of Skogliti, high surf and outlying rocks were very troublesome to landing craft. Here is a sample incident. A boat from Transport Thomas Jefferson, commanded by Ensign G.P. Limberis, seeking a small beach in pitchy darkness, hit instead a rocky point. The troops, understandably, flinched from debarking in heavy surf on a rock-bound coast. But after much persuasion, reported the ensign, every man in my boat was on the beach, and crew and myself salvaged the 2 .30 caliber machine guns and a few rounds of ammunition. 4 Italians who manned a nearby machine gun were so astounded at this exploit that they promptly surrendered. Presently Limberis and his men heard shouts and screams in the water. 2 boats in the second wave, following the same erroneous course, had collided and swamped when their coxswains sighted the rocks and tried to sheer off. The first-comers scrambled down the steep and slippery rocks and managed to pull 4 GLs out of the water, but some 38 others were drowned. The third boat wave, at 4:15 a.m., barely escaped crashing and put its troops ashore safely on the rocky point, but lost 5 boats out of 7. The combination of heavy surf, want of definite landmarks, and inexperienced boat crews made landing craft casualties in Scent area almost as great as in the Moroccan landings of Operation Torch. The saddest event in the American sector was the shooting down of transport aircraft towing gliders carrying American paratroops. General Ridgway decided on the morning of 11 July to lay a big airdrop on Forello, which, as he did not know, was already occupied by American troops. His opposite number ordered a similar one in the British sector. There was not enough time to inform ships and army units ashore what was coming. The route for the transport planes and gliders lay right along the battlefront and over the ships whose anti-aircraft gunners were trigger-happy after 2 days of frequent air attack. Between 9:50 p.m. and 11 p.m., the Germans sent in a heavy air raid, 24th of that busy day, wherein the Axis committed 381 planes against ships off the assault beaches. Right on top of that came our own transport planes. Recognition signals were of no avail in the tracer-filled night sky. Anti-aircraft gunners ashore and on shipboard fired at friend and foe alike. 23 of the 144 planes which took off from Tunisia failed to return, and 37 were badly damaged. Almost 100 officers and men were killed or missing. A special board was convened by General Eisenhower to study this airdrop, and a similarly shot-up one over the British sector. It concluded that these tragic fiascos were caused by not allowing sufficient time to notify friendly ground and naval forces, flying over them during an enemy bombing attack, and at such low altitudes as to make identification friend or foe inoperative. These errors were not repeated. In justice to the air forces, we must remember that their main efforts against enemy airfields and lines of communication were so successful that air attacks on the amphibious forces were kept to a minimum, and none were delivered in the American sector after 13 July. The British sector, lying nearer mainland airdromes, continued to catch it nightly under the waxing moon, and as soon as the United States naval forces came around to Palermo, the Luftwaffe found them again. For reasons of space, I shall have to pass rapidly over the British landings of Vice Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay's Eastern Task Force, between Formiche, on the west side of Cape Passero, and Cassibile, not far south of Syracuse. The Royal Navy's part was conducted with the same verve and efficiency as that of the United States Navy. The British had the easier meteorological conditions for landing, as their beaches were sheltered from the wind on D-Day, but they suffered more from enemy air attack. The American troops met stouter initial opposition, but after 15 July it was the other way round. Although the British and Americans landed on different sections of the coast, a close coordination was maintained between upper levels of command, and the two navies got along so well that a more intimate intermingling could be attempted in the next operation. Before that could start, Sicily had to be conquered.